The wind howling down from the granite peaks of the Sawtooth Range did not just carry snow. It carried a biting, physical weight that felt like a hammer against the ribs. Thaddeus stood in the wreckage of what had been his barn, his gloved hands gripping a splintered support beam that had snapped like a dry twig during the gale 2 nights prior. The structure was a skeleton now, stripped of its siding and roof, leaving the interior entirely exposed to the merciless Wyoming sky. At 70 years old, Thaddeus felt the cold settle into his joints with a familiarity that was almost affectionate, a constant companion that reminded him he was still alive, even if barely. His 3 horses, Buster, a roan gelding with a calm disposition, Coco, a mare with a nervous tick, and the old pack horse Gray, huddled together in the lee of the ranch house, their breath pluming in thick, distressed clouds. They were shivering, their winter coats thick but insufficient against the cutting wind that sliced through the valley. Thaddeus turned away from the ruin and pulled a crumpled letter from the deep pocket of his wool coat. It was from the lumber mill in Ironwood, the nearest town, and the news it carried was as grim as the gray clouds gathering overhead. The price of milled lumber had tripled in the last month due to a supply chain failure back east and a fire at the main regional processing plant. Thaddeus ran his thumb over the ink, smudging the exorbitant numbers. He had the money to feed himself through the winter, and he had the money to feed the horses, but he did not have the money to rebuild a barn from scratch at these gouged prices. He looked back at the horses. Without shelter, they would not survive the deep freeze that everyone knew was coming. The white wolf, the locals called it. A winter that didn't just freeze water, but froze the sap in the trees until they exploded. He walked over to Buster, resting his forehead against the horse's warm neck. The animal smelled of dust and anxiety. "I know," Thaddeus murmured, his voice rough like gravel rolling in a tin pan. "I know, boy. I'm thinking." He was a man who had outlived 2 wives and 3 fluctuating economies, a man who had built this ranch with nothing but a pickaxe and stubbornness. He was not about to let the weather finish him now. He needed a solution that didn't require lumber he couldn't afford or labor he couldn't hire. He needed a miracle, or, failing that, a very practical mistake to exploit. He looked up at the rocky hillside that bordered his property, where the dark, jagged maw of the earth stared back at him. The mine had been abandoned 10 years ago, a relic of a silver rush that turned out to be mostly lead and disappointment. It sat on the northern edge of Thaddeus's property, a dark scar in the limestone that the town of Ironwood had largely forgotten, save for the teenagers who sometimes dared each other to stand at the entrance. It was called the Black Dog Drift, a name earned because miners swore they heard growling in the depths. Thaddeus had never believed in ghosts, only in geology. He hiked up the scree slope, his boots crunching loudly on the loose shale, his breath coming in short, rhythmic huffs. The wind tore at his coat, trying to push him back down, but he leaned into the incline, driven by the desperation of the shivering animals below. When he reached the entrance, the air changed instantly. He stepped past the rotted frame of the original support bracing and into the throat of the mountain. The howling wind died, replaced by a heavy, profound silence. But it wasn't the silence that stopped him. It was the temperature. It was 55 degrees inside. Constant. Geothermal consistency. Thaddeus pulled off a glove and placed his hand against the rough stone wall. It wasn't warm exactly, but compared to the 20-degree bite outside, it felt like a heated parlor. He walked deeper, lighting a kerosene lantern he had brought from the house. The flame didn't flicker. The air was still, but it wasn't stale. There was a draft, a natural chimney effect caused by a vertical shaft further back that vented to the surface. He checked the floor. It was solid rock, leveled out by the miners years ago to run their ore carts. It was dirty, littered with debris, broken rock, and rusted iron spikes, but it was flat, and it was dry. He paced the width of the main tunnel, 12 feet wide, 7 feet high. He paced the length until the tunnel narrowed significantly, about 50 yards in. He did the math in his head, visualizing stall dimensions, feed storage, and tack room space. He saw the layout not as a dark hole, but as a blueprint. He saw drainage channels cut into the rock. He saw heavy canvas curtains to regulate the airflow. He saw survival. "A stable," he whispered, the words echoing softly against the stone. A stable in the stone. It was madness, according to any conventional rancher. Horses needed light, air, and wood. Putting them underground seemed like burying them alive. But Thaddeus looked at the lantern flame, steady and bright. He wasn't looking for conventional. He was looking for effective. The next morning, Thaddeus hitched Gray to the buckboard wagon and rode into Ironwood. He didn't need fresh lumber, but he needed hardware. Hinges, heavy bolts, bags of lime for sanitation, and as much second-hand timber as he could scavenge. He pulled up to the general store, the wheels of his wagon caking with the freezing mud of the main street. The town was busy with the frantic energy of pre-winter preparation. Men were boarding up windows, women were buying flour and sugar in bulk. Thaddeus moved through them like a ghost, his focus singular. He was loading a keg of nails onto the counter when Kincaid, the owner of the largest cattle operation in the valley, stepped up beside him. Kincaid was a man who wore his wealth in the silver conchos on his hat and the pristine condition of his duster coat. He looked at Thaddeus's meager pile of supplies and then at the old man's weathered face. "Building a coffin, Thad?" Kincaid asked, his voice booming enough to draw the attention of the other patrons. "Heard the wind took your barn. Tough break." Thaddeus didn't look up from counting out his coins. "Barn's gone," he admitted, his voice low and steady. "Building something else." Kincaid leaned in, a smirk playing on his lips. "With what wood? Mill says you didn't place an order. You planning to weave a stable out of straw?" The men around the potbelly stove chuckled. Thaddeus placed his coins on the counter, one by one. Clink, clink, clink. "Using the black dog," Thaddeus said simply. "Moving the horses inside the drift." The store went silent for a heartbeat, and then Kincaid laughed, a harsh, barking sound. "The mine? You're putting livestock in a hole? They'll go blind, old man, or they'll suffocate. That's not a stable, that's a tomb." Thaddeus picked up his nails. He turned to Kincaid, his eyes clear and hard. "It's 55 degrees in there, Kincaid. Wind don't blow through granite." He walked out, the laughter of the town following him, heavy with derision. They called him senile. They called him cheap. But as he loaded the wagon, Thaddeus didn't feel shame. He felt the cold nipping at his nose, and he knew, with the certainty of a man who watches the sky, that the laughter would freeze in their throats soon enough. The work was brutal, a solitary war against neglect and geology. For 2 weeks, Thaddeus lived in a rhythm of grueling physical exertion. He woke before dawn, drank black coffee, and worked until his muscles trembled. The first task was clearing the floor. He used a shovel and a wheelbarrow to haul out tons of loose scree and rusted mining junk, dumping it down the slope outside. His back ached with a constant dull fire, but he didn't stop. Once the floor was clear, he had to address the drainage. He couldn't have the horses standing in their own waste. The ammonia would kill them in a confined space. Using a heavy sledgehammer and a cold chisel, he spent 3 agonizing days cutting a shallow trench down the center of the stone floor, angling it toward the mine entrance where the natural slope would carry runoff away. The sound of steel on stone, clack, 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 became the heartbeat of the mountain. His hands blistered, wept, calloused over, and blistered again. He scavenged wood from the ruined barn, dragging the splintered planks up the hill. He didn't need them for weatherproofing, only for partition. He built the stalls not as cages, but as dividers, securing them into the rock walls using iron pitons he hammered into existing fissures. He built a gate at the entrance, not solid wood, but a heavy frame covered in double-layered canvas that he could roll up or down to control the temperature and air intake. He rigged a ventilation system using old stovepipes he found in the town dump, running them up the vertical shaft to ensure a constant draw of fresh air. It wasn't pretty. It looked like a shipwreck inside a cave, but it was sturdy. He tested every gate, shaking them with all his weight. They held. He brought in straw, bale after bale, creating a deep golden bedding that smelled of summer fields, a sharp contrast to the damp mineral scent of the cave. He hung lanterns at intervals, creating pools of warm amber light that pushed back the crushing dark. When he was finished, he stood in the center of the drift, wiping sweat from his forehead. It was silent, save for the low hum of the air drawing through the pipes. It was ugly, strange, and absolutely magnificent. The first test came in early November. The sky turned the color of a bruised plum, and the temperature plummeted 20 degrees in an hour. The wind picked up, screaming through the canyons with a violence that shook the shingles on Thaddeus's cabin. It was time. He went out to the paddock where Buster, Coco, and Gray were huddled, their tails turned to the wind, shivering violently. "Come on," he said, clipping lead ropes to their halters. "Let's go inside." The horses were terrified of the dark, gaping mouth of the mine. Coco reared, her eyes rolling white in panic. Thaddeus didn't shout. He didn't pull. He stood close to her, stroking her nose, letting her smell the dust and safety on his clothes. "Trust me," he murmured. "It's warm. Just trust me." It took an hour of coaxing, inch by inch, but he got them across the threshold. The moment they stepped inside, the change in their demeanor was instant. The roaring wind became a distant murmur. The biting cold vanished, replaced by the cool, still air of the earth. Thaddeus led them to their stalls, deep with straw. Buster shook his mane, the dust flying, and immediately began to eat from the hay net. Coco stopped trembling. Gray let out a long, heavy sigh and leaned against the wooden partition. Thaddeus closed the canvas flap at the entrance, securing it against the gale outside. He lit the lanterns. The golden light reflected off the rock walls and the horses' coats. He sat on an overturned crate, listening to the sound of them chewing, a rhythmic, peaceful crunching that drowned out the storm. He checked the thermometer he had hung on a support beam. 54 degrees. Outside, it was 5 below zero. He poured himself a cup of coffee from a thermos, his hand shaking slightly, not from cold, but from relief. He was safe. They were safe. The town could laugh all they wanted, but tonight, his horses were sleeping in a fortress of stone. December settled over the valley like a heavy gray blanket, bringing a cold that seemed intent on finding the marrow of every living thing. For Thaddeus, however, life had found a strange, subterranean rhythm. His mornings did not begin with the agonizing ritual of chipping ice from water troughs. Instead, he walked from his cabin to the mine entrance, the snow crunching loudly under his boots, and ducked under the heavy canvas curtain. Inside, the air was still and thick with the earthy scent of straw and the warm, musky smell of horses. The temperature hovered at 54 degrees, regulated by the Earth's mass. He developed a routine that was almost military in its precision. First, he checked the ventilation drift at the back of the mine. He had rigged a simple telltale, a strip of cloth hanging from the rusted iron grate. If it fluttered inward, the air was drawing correctly. If it hung still, he had to light a small fire in the secondary shaft to create a thermal draft that pulled the stale air out. Next came the mucking. Without the sun to dry the stalls, hygiene was his primary enemy. He used the bags of lime he had bought, sprinkling the white powder over the wet spots in the rock floor to neutralize the ammonia before laying down fresh straw. It was hard, repetitive labor, loading the heavy wheelbarrow and pushing it up the incline to the spoil pile outside. But his horses were thriving. Their coats were glossy, their eyes bright. They greeted him with soft nickers, not the desperate, shivering silences of animals conserving heat. In town, the mood was darkening with the days. Thaddeus rode Gray into Ironwood once a week for supplies, and the difference between his reality and the town's was becoming stark. The general store was quiet, the usual banter replaced by grim reports of frozen pipes and livestock losing weight. The price of hay had skyrocketed, and firewood was becoming scarce as folks burned through their cords faster than anticipated. When Thaddeus walked in, stamping the snow from his boots, the silence that greeted him was no longer mocking. It was resentful. He looked too healthy. He didn't have the wind-burned, frost-nipped cheeks that the other ranchers sported. He bought his coffee and his lime, paying in cash. On his way out, he passed the livery stable. The doors were shut tight, but he could hear the coughing of horses inside, a dry, hacking sound that signaled respiratory distress from cold, damp draughts. The stable master, a man named Halloway who had laughed loudest at Thaddeus's hole in the wall, was outside chopping wood with frantic, angry swings. Halloway didn't look at Thaddeus, but the tension radiating off him was palpable. They knew Thaddeus's horses were warm. They just couldn't bring themselves to ask how. The pride of the frontier was a brittle thing, often breaking only when the alternative was total ruin. Thaddeus didn't gloat. He just pulled his collar up and rode back toward the mountain, knowing that the white wolf hadn't even truly howled yet. The break came 3 weeks into January, with a weather event that the almanacs would later describe as the Great Freeze of '94, but which the locals simply called the Killing Frost. The temperature didn't just drop, it crashed. The thermometer on Thaddeus's porch read 30 below zero before the wind chill was even factored in. The wind screamed down the valley at 60 miles an hour, driving snow so hard it stripped paint from wood. Inside the mine, the canvas curtain bowed inward under the pressure, straining against its bolts, but the air inside held at 48 degrees, cooler than before, but safe. Thaddeus was brushing Coco when he heard a sound over the wind. Not a howl, but a frantic pounding. He walked to the entrance and unlatched the side of the curtain. A figure stumbled in, coated in ice, eyebrows frozen white. It was Kincaid. The wealthy rancher looked smaller now, his duster stiff with frozen sleet, his face gray with hypothermia and panic. He collapsed onto a hay bale, gasping for the relatively warm air of the drift. "My barn," Kincaid managed to choke out, his teeth chattering so hard the words were barely intelligible. "Roof. The snow load. The main beam cracked. It's coming down, Thad. I got 20 head of quarter horses, the best bloodlines in the state. They're going to freeze. They're going to die tonight." He looked up at Thaddeus, his eyes watering. All the arrogance from the general store was gone, stripped away by the indifferent brutality of nature. "Halloway's livery is full. No one else has room. You got the space. I know you do." Thaddeus looked at the man, then back at the empty expanse of the dark tunnel stretching behind his own 3 horses. He had the space. He had the ventilation. But this wasn't just about space. It was about resources. "I can't feed 20 head on my stock, Kincaid," Thaddeus said, his voice flat. "And I won't shovel muck for 20 horses for free." Kincaid nodded frantically, fumbling with frozen fingers for a heavy pouch at his belt. "I'll pay. Boarding fees, feed costs, labor, double the town rate. Just don't let 'em freeze." Thaddeus looked at the money pouch, then at the desperate man. "Keep your money for now. Go get 'em. If they can walk, bring 'em. But if they're sick, they stay out. I won't risk my herd." The next 6 hours were a blur of chaotic high-stakes logistics. Thaddeus lit every lantern he owned, stringing them further down the tunnel until the black dog glowed like a cathedral. Kincaid returned with his hands, leading a string of terrified, shivering animals through the blinding whiteout. The horses were skittish, their nostrils flared with the scent of the underground, but the moment they crossed the threshold, the survival instinct took over. They felt the stillness. They felt the absence of the biting wind. Thaddeus became a traffic controller, directing Kincaid's hands to tie off horses at intervals along the rock walls, utilizing the iron pitons he had driven into the fissures weeks ago. He forced the men to rub the horses down with straw immediately to remove the ice from their coats, preventing the dampness from chilling the air. By midnight, the mine was transformed. 23 horses stood in the drift. The sound was incredible. The shifting of hooves, the snorting, the chewing of hay, it echoed off the granite walls, amplifying the sense of life. The temperature in the mine actually began to rise. The body heat of 20 large animals. Thaddeus was no longer the outcast. He was the captain of the only lifeboat that mattered. But as the storm outside intensified, burying the entrance in drifting snow, a new danger arose. The air in the back of the tunnel was getting heavy. The ventilation shaft wasn't drawing enough for this many lungs. The crisis hit at 3 a.m. One of the younger mares at the far end of the string started stumbling, her breathing labored and shallow. Thaddeus noticed the lanterns at the rear of the tunnel were burning dimmer than the ones at the front. Oxygen deprivation. The carbon dioxide from 23 horses and the carbon monoxide from the lanterns were pooling in the dead air. The chimney was blocked, likely by a drift of snow capping the vent hole up on the ridge. Kincaid saw Thaddeus staring at the dim flame and realized the danger. "Air?" he asked, panic rising again. "We're suffocating them?" Thaddeus moved instantly. "Kill the lanterns in the back," he ordered. "Bring those horses forward." He grabbed a coil of rope and a long iron pry bar. "I have to clear the vent." "You can't go out there," Kincaid argued. "It's 40 below. You'll get lost 10 feet from the door." Thaddeus ignored him. He wasn't going outside. He was going up. The ventilation shaft wasn't a smooth pipe. It was a rough, vertical, jagged cut in the rock, with an old, rusted ladder bolted to the side that hadn't been used in a decade. Thaddeus tied a kerchief around his face. "Keep the horses calm. If I don't clear the cap, we lose the herd." He climbed into the darkness of the vertical shaft. The air here was bad, stale, and hot. The rungs of the ladder were slick with condensation. He climbed 30 feet, his old muscles screaming, the darkness pressing in. He could hear the wind howling above him, muffled by the snow plug. When he reached the top, he found the blockage, a dense, frozen plug of snow and ice that had drifted over the grate. He jammed the pry bar upward, grunting with effort. It was like hitting concrete. He struck it again, and again. His lungs burned for air. On the fourth strike, the ice cracked. A shaft of freezing cold air punched him in the face, delicious and sharp. He shoved the bar through, widening the hole, and the pressure differential took over. The stale, warm air from below rushed up past him, carrying the heat and the bad gas out into the night. Below, the lanterns flickered and flared bright again. Thaddeus rested his forehead against the cold iron rung, breathing the mix of freezing storm air and warm barn smells, alive and victorious. Spring arrived not with a gentle greening, but with the violent sound of dripping water. The great melt turned the valley into a muddy slush, but the sky was a piercing, brilliant blue. On the first Tuesday of March, Thaddeus rolled up the canvas curtain for the last time that season. The light that flooded the mine was blinding. One by one, he and Kincaid led the horses out. They emerged blinking, their coats thick and dusty, but their ribs were well covered and their legs were strong. Obsidian, the stallion, shook his head and let out a defiant whinny that echoed across the valley. Down in the town, the devastation was visible. collapsed roofs, dead orchards, and thin, haggard livestock that had barely survived the exposure. The contrast was undeniable. Kincaid stood by the wagon, counting out a stack of gold coins, payment for the board, the feed, and the life of his herd. He handed the heavy stack to Thaddeus. There was no mockery left in the man, only a sober respect. "I'll be rebuilding the barn," Kincaid said, looking at the mine entrance. "But I'd like to keep a contract with you for next winter, for the overflow, if you're willing." Thaddeus weighed the coins in his hand. It was enough to buy lumber, enough to fix his house, enough to live comfortably for years. He looked at the dark mouth of the Black Dog Drift. It wasn't a scary place anymore. It was a partner. "I'm willing," Thaddeus said, "but the rate goes up if you wait until the snow flies to ask." Kincaid laughed, a genuine sound this time, and offered his hand. Thaddeus took it. As the rancher rode away, Thaddeus turned back to the mine. He picked up a lantern and walked inside to start the spring cleaning. The town had seen a hole in the ground and laughed. Thaddeus had seen a shelter. He patted the cold granite wall with a gloved hand. It was solid. It was grounded. And it was the only barn he would ever need.